Thank you for joining me on this trip through one of the scariest cases in history. Today, we're going to explore the dark sides of the Appalachians, where something out of this world happened in the remote areas of North Carolina. Let us know in the comments where you're watching this investigation from if clears throat. It is not true that this movie was made. It was just made for fun. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, is just a coincidence. It wasn't until 1894 that the first rumors spread through the isolated Appalachian mountain villages. At that time, North Carolina was made up of thick fogs, thick forests that were impossible to get through, and communities that were so far away from each other that they could go months without talking to anyone else. The roads were dangerous. They were just rough dirt paths that wound around steep hills and rocky peaks. It was hard to live there because people worked on small farms and cut down trees for the sawmills that were spread out all over the region. People lived by their own rules, away from the law and the busy society that lived in coastal cities. They did this in dusty taverns and on the porches of wooden homes. People in the area started talking about a family that lived in the mountains, way up high and out of the way. No one was sure of the time they got there, or the place they came from. They were said to have been hidden among the old pine and oak trees for many generations. Some swore that. They showed up out of nowhere, like the forest had given birth to them. There was something very wrong with that lineage. That much everyone agreed on. The first reports were not clear and were almost whispered out of fear that someone was listening. Strange things happened to travelers on the most remote trails. They saw abandoned houses with strange markings on the walls, heard campfires burning by themselves in the middle of the night, and saw sounds that didn't belong to any known animal. And that feeling that you are being watched by eyes that can't be seen among the trees. No one in the family ever went into the villages. They never went to the nearby stores to buy supplies. They never went to any of the many Baptist churches in the area. There were ghosts in the mountains, and people only talked about them around the fireplace during the long, scary winter nights. Things changed, though, in 1894. Something that would bring this secret family tree out of the shadows and find out secrets that should have stayed hidden for a long time. A lumber buyer who worked for one of the big sawmills in the county had to check out a new area further north where the trees were old and valuable. He made a small camp and started making a map of the area. During one of these trips, he found the first sign. A man-made clearing cut loosely into the forest where there should have been only natural beauty. In the middle of this clearing were what looked like homes, but were built in a very basic and almost grotesque way. The logs were stacked without any clear method. The roofs were covered with moss and branches, and the windows were just dark holes in the wood. The merchant walked up slowly. He yelled, but there was no sound of life or smoke coming from the makeshift chimneys. All he could hear was the echo of his own voice coming back from the mountains nearby. When he finally got the nerve to look through one of the holes, he was horrified by what he saw. It's dark inside and smells like something is breaking down. There were marks that looked like they were made by hand. Deep scratches in the wood make patterns that are hard to understand. He went back to the Mitchell County town that was closest and told the police officer about what he had found. The man wasn't sure because he had heard a lot of lies about workers being scared of being alone in the mountains. They were both looking at the trader with fear in their eyes, though, which made him decide to look into it. He got together a group of men he trusted, armed with rifles and lanterns. They went up the steep trails to get to the clearing that was described. What they found that fall day would change the way people thought about that area forever. They saw their family, but not how they thought they would. They weren't dangerous criminals or violent fugitives. They were something different, something that couldn't be explained. They lived in such a basic way that it seemed impossible for them to stay alive without the right tools, pets, or any way to connect with the modern world. And when they spoke, it sounded like they had made up their own language while being very alone. It was a strange mix of Old English and something that no one else could understand. The most scary part was still to come, though, because this dark story is only just beginning. In the Appalachian Mountains, the secrets of this family would be slowly revealed, with each new clue more unsettling than the last. This would create a picture of mystery that is still hard to understand today. The police stayed in the clearing for hours, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. The family wasn't mean, but they also didn't offer any explanations either. They just stood there and stared at the visitors as if they were seeing things from another world. There were at least 12 people there, but it was hard to tell for sure because the trees around them blocked out the light. So many patches were sewn on their clothes that it was impossible to tell what fabric it was made of. These people were shaped by the sun and the cold wind of. Faces that looked like they had aged faster than they should have because of the high elevations. Officers from the police force tried to get in touch. He asked them what their names were, where they were from, and how long they had been there. The answers came slowly, with words drawn out in that strange language that had sounds that were both familiar and foreign. One of the oldest men in the family, who seemed to be the patriarch, only managed to be partially understood. The mountain ranges had always been there, he said. Their home since a time no one else could remember. When asked for records, papers, or any other kind of legal proof, he just shook his head. There wasn't anything. There were no papers, certificates, or links to the organized society that was beyond those mountains. The discovery caused a lot of disagreement in the county. In what way could a whole family live on the edges of everything? In 1895, people from the state government went up the trails to do a more thorough investigation. They got notepads and pen trying to make a list of this ghost population. But it seemed like every question brought up more questions than it answered. Ages that weren't clear, family relationships that weren't clear, and stories that didn't make sense together. When asked about births, the family pointed to the forest, as if the mountains were proof enough. When people were asked about deaths, they kept very quiet. The researchers noticed that the homes were different in some way. There weren't any clear lines between the rooms. It looked like everyone lived, crowded into the unstable structures with no privacy and no clear sense of order. Things that belonged to them were few and far between. Some rough wooden tools, tree bark containers, and simple tools that looked like they were made from stones and branches. There were no valuables, books, or other signs of a link to the world beyond that forgotten clearing. But what really bothered the visitors was that they always felt like something was being kept from them. Family members looked at each other quickly, as if they were sharing. There were secrets that couldn't be told. When the investigators tried to look into the areas around the clearing, they were gently led off of certain paths. There were places the family clearly didn't want strangers to go, like trails that went deep into the woods and were marked with little signs that only they seemed to understand. There were stories in North Carolina newspapers about the discovery. In some places, the case was called The Lost Family of Appalachia. There was, both fascinating and horrifying at the same time. In a country that was proud of its progress and civilization in the 1800s, how was this possible? There were more theories. Some of them thought they were related to colonists who had lived alone for many generations because of strong religious beliefs. Others said they were runaways from an ancient tragedy who were hiding in the mountains to avoid being caught. Some people even thought it might have had even darker roots, like ties to groups that did strange rituals far away from the public's eyes. The government tried to bring the family up to speed with the rest of society. They gave people official land, helped them build decent homes, and gave kids who looked younger access to schools. but all of their offers were turned down with a silent, firm refusal. The outside world didn't want anything from them. The mountains were their home, and they planned to stay there no matter what happened or what other people thought. During the next few months, some brave local residents tried to get in touch with each other better. They came with food and tools and tried to teach them basic ways to farm and build. The family was polite when they accepted the gifts, but they never thanked the givers or showed interest in learning. The way they lived was like they were in a parallel world where normal rules of life didn't apply. Then people who were visiting the area started going missing, not family members. At first, they were just a few cases that were easily explained by the dangerous. The mountains, a hunter who didn't come back, or a traveler who got lost. But the number of occurrences grew, and there was always a disturbing pattern. When they were last seen, they were all near where the family lived. The strange events kept happening one after the other, making it impossible to ignore them. This spread fear through nearby towns like thick fog on a cold Appalachian morning. The people in charge of Mitchell County were in a tough spot. There was no strong evidence linking a family to the disappearances, just a series of events that pointed to something bad. In 1896, the sheriff of the area put together a bigger trip and invited people from 3 nearby counties. The plan was to search the area thoroughly, make a map of the whole area where the family lived, and look for any clues that could help explain what happened to those who had gone missing. The expedition set out in the spring, when the trails were clear of snow while still being snowy. There were 15 men, altogether with enough food for a week. They climbed the steep slopes by following the tracks left by earlier groups. When they got to the clearing, they saw the family living their strange, alone life as before, as if they didn't care about what was going on around them. The sheriff told them why they were there. They needed to look in the nearby areas for signs of the people who were missing. The head of the family listened quietly and then just nodded as if to say yes. But there was. He seemed sure of himself in a scary way, like he knew that no matter how hard they looked, they would never find anything. There were several groups of men who went into the forest to look for things. They found more buildings hidden in the trees. These were small huts spread out in a random way. Some looked like they had not been used in a long time, while others looked like they had been used recently. Inside, there were the same simple objects arranged in a jumbled way, but nothing that could be used as proof of a crime. There were no signs of struggle or the men's belongings. Violence. They found marks all over the place. They were carved into trees, scratched into rocks, and drawn on the packed earth. These marks were symbols that didn't fit with any known alphabet. There were geometric patterns and organic shapes mixed together, as if someone had tried to take something from nature and turn it into language. The men on the expedition wrote down some of these symbols in their notebooks so that they could show them to experts who could figure out what they meant. One of the deputies got off track during the search. Group. He took a narrow path that led down into a deep valley where the trees were so thick that the sun barely reached them. He found something that made his blood chill, a circle of land that had been pounded into a hard, stone-like surface and had no plants in it at all. In the middle were ashes from old campfires that looked like they had been there for decades. Around the circle, wooden stakes had been driven into the ground and marked with those strange symbols. When he spoke about when the others found out, there was immediate discomfort. No one wanted to say the word out loud, but it looked like a place for rituals. The sheriff decided that they needed more information before making any assumptions. They took pictures of the site with the simple cameras available at the time, making sure to record everything carefully. But when they tried to ask the family about the place, all they got were empty stares and a firm refusal to speak. When they got back to the villages, they had more questions than answers. They copied. Professors of linguistics and anthropology at universities on the East Coast tried to figure out what the symbols meant, but were unsuccessful. They were not similar to any known native language or to any old European dialects. They were one of a kind because they were made or kept alive by that isolated family in the mountains. They were a code that held secrets that might never be revealed. Over the next few months, public pressure grew. Families of the missing people demanded action and wanted the arranged family to be taken off the mountains, forced to live under watch where they could be watched. But lawyers for the state pointed out the legal problem. There was no proof of a crime. There were only hints and chances. Not having solid proof before forcing people to leave their land would be an abuse of power and could set a bad example. In 1897, a temporary solution was put forward. There would be an outpost set up near where the family lived. There would always be guards there, watching what people do, and keeping track of who came into and left the area. The family wouldn't be bothered directly, but they would have a lot less privacy. The idea was that having authorities around all the time would stop people from doing anything wrong and keep lost travelers from getting lost in those dangerous lands. Because it was built on a rise, the outpost had a partial view of the main clearing. It was a simple but strong building that could easily fit 4 men. The first guard sent to. The men at the outpost were veterans who were used to being alone and the dangers of the mountains. They were told very clearly to watch and report, but not to get involved unless they saw direct proof of a crime. The first reports were all the same. Days went by with nothing interesting happening. The family kept doing their strange routine. They moved through the forest in ways that looked random but were probably based on some logic that they only knew about. Sometimes smoke rose from makeshift fireplaces. Sometimes voices could be heard through the trees, and the language was so hard to understand that it hung in the air like a lament. But on a late autumn night with no moon, something happened that would change the whole course of the investigation. Guards at the outpost said they saw strange lights moving through the trees. It wasn't the warm yellow of torches or lanterns. Instead, there was something else, almost green, moving through the trees as if it had its own life. Sounds that didn't belong were there with the lights, drawn out. Melodies that made the hairs on the backs of even the bravest men stand on end. Guards were wide awake all night, watching those strange lights move through the trees. They were all afraid to leave their posts to look into it more. There was something very wrong with those movements, and the way the light seemed to float instead of rising and falling like a lantern or fire. When dawn finally came, thick fog covered the mountains like a shroud, and the lights went out completely, as if they had never been there. The report was sent to the sheriff, who was doubtful at first. It wasn't really new to see strange lights in the mountains. Natural events, reflections in rock crystals, or even gases escaping from the ground that made optical illusions could explain them. The situation became more important when 3 of the 4 guards swore they would leave their posts if they weren't taken seriously. That same week, an investigation was set up. This time, one of them was a middle-aged professor of natural sciences from a university in Raleigh, who was known for being logical and using the scientific method. He came with measuring tools, cameras, and a thick notebook that he planned to use to write down everything he saw. His presence made the local authorities feel better because they hoped to finally find logical reasons for the strange events. When the group got to the area in the afternoon, they set up their outpost before. It got dark. The professor measured the soil, took samples of plants, and looked at the rock formations for the first few hours. For a remote mountain area in North Carolina, everything seemed to be fine. His instrument readings didn't show anything strange, but he agreed to stay the night and see if the lights would come back on. They waited not long. The first manifestations happened exactly as the author said they would around 10 o'clock, when the forest was completely dark. As guards watched, greenish lights appeared in the trees and moved in a random but planned way. The professor tried to take pictures of them, but all his cameras could do was blur the images. The tools he used to measure didn't show any big changes. There is no energy source that could explain those bright things. They watched the lights go around and around in the forest for hours. There was a time when they seemed to gather near the ritual circle that had been found weeks before. The professor suggested that they go for A. The guards flatly refused to let them do a more detailed observation. No one could explain it logically, but there was something in the air that made everyone feel like danger was close at hand. It felt like the air was heavier and had an electric charge that made the hairs on their arms stand on end. As dawn came, the lights slowly went out and blended with the mist that rose from the valleys. The professor looked scared, and something that went against everything he knew made him lose faith in science. An attempt to explain. He said he didn't know the answers and only had more questions. He said he would come back with better tools and maybe talk to co-workers who studied unusual atmospheric events, but there was doubt in his voice, as if he knew that no tools would be enough to solve the mystery. Over the next few days, people from nearby villages started to talk about their own experiences. Farmers said that animals were acting strangely, like not wanting to graze in certain areas or mooing a lot at night. Skilled hunters, men who knew every inch of those mountains, said they got lost on trails they had been on hundreds of times. It looked like compasses were spinning for no reason, even though there were no known mineral deposits that could mess up magnetic instruments. When 1898 came around, things got much worse. There was a problem, but some religious people thought it was spiritual instead of natural. They planned their own trip and brought holy water, Bibles, and crucifixes with them. They thought the family in the mountains had something to do with it. With evil forces and doing rituals that let things in that shouldn't have been called upon. They climbed the trails while singing hymns, ready to face what they saw as an evil manifestation. The family treated them with the usual lack of interest. They didn't seem scared of or angry about the religious symbols or the people who were there. They did nothing but watch as the religious people walked through the camp, pouring holy water on people and reading from the Bible out loud. The king kept an eye on everything with an, this expression could be taken as mild, almost amused interest. When the religious figures finally left, they were tired and had not caused any reaction. There was a strong sense of failure. On the same night, though, something happened that no one saw coming. The religious men set up camp a few miles away and planned to come back the next day with more help. At very early in the morning, sounds coming from the direction of the clearing woke them up. They were not the weird ones, melodies that have been reported before, but something else. They sounded like human voices, with many voices singing together in that strange language. The volume slowly rose as it echoed through the mountains until it seemed to be coming from everywhere at the same time. The religious men quickly gathered their things and sped down the trails as fast as they could because it was getting dark. 2 of them hurt themselves badly when they fell during the descent. When they finally got to the next village early in the morning, they were. Shock. That mountain made them promise to never go back because they felt something there that went beyond any idea of good and evil they had. It was something older and more mysterious that had been there in the shadows since before the first Europeans came to the continent to settle. The things that happened that night changed how people thought about the Appalachian family. A group of people living alone in a very basic way was once seen as an interesting anthropological topic, but now it has a much darker meaning. The stories get around quickly, and each time they're told, they get more dramatic. People whispered in taverns and markets about old curses and forbidden knowledge that was kept in the high mountains that no one could reach. There was pressure on North Carolina's governor to make a decision. He called a meeting in 1899 with local officials, police officers from several counties, and even members of the state army. The matter was touchy. What to do with people who technically had not done anything illegal, but whose presence made many people afraid. The solution that was suggested was a bad middle ground. The family would be closely watched all the time, but they would not be taken away against their will. Any attempt to move forces could lead to legal and political problems that the government wanted to avoid. The outpost got bigger and stronger. More guards were sent out to work in shifts, so that there would always be someone watching. Simple signaling systems were installed and placed mirrors in a way that would reflect sunlight so that quick messages could be sent to the villages in case of an emergency. It cost a lot of money and put a strain on the finances of a rural county, but it was thought to be necessary because the situation was so bad. The routine had been set for months. The guards kept daily records of everything they saw the family do and every step they took. They found some interesting patterns. The activities of the family seemed to be based on the phases of the moon. When the moon is new, they stayed mostly hidden and didn't leave their homes very often. But as the moon got bigger, they got busier and moved through the forest in small groups, doing things that people watching couldn't quite figure out. One of the guards, who paid the most attention, noticed something odd about the family. Besides the obvious patriarch, he couldn't see any other clear levels of authority. There didn't seem to be clear gender or age-based roles in how people shared their responsibilities. Getting along. The amount of talking they did was very low. It was almost as if they didn't need to talk to each other all the time and understood each other in ways that others couldn't see. Since surveillance was stepped up, there have been no more disappearances at all. This made people in the nearby towns feel a little better, but it also brought up some troubling questions. Were they really to blame for the previous disappearances? Or was the connection just a coincidence? And had there been no more disappearances? Some other reasons? There was no sure way to know. And this uncertainty made everyone less sure of what they thought would happen. As the year 1900 came to a close, there was a cautious sense of optimism. There were hopes for progress and the triumph of science over superstition in the new century. The authorities hoped that the family would eventually become more like other families and give up their strange customs for a more normal life. This hope turned out to be very unrealistic. The winter of that year was very bad, and a very heavy snowstorm cut off the mountainous area from the rest of the world. For weeks, the trails could not be used. The outpost could not talk to anyone or get supplies. The guards who were stationed there had to carefully ration the food they had stored until the weather got better. And it was while they were being locked up alone that they saw something that makes no sense. They saw it on the coldest night of the season, when it got so cold that your breath would freeze right away. People in the family walking barefoot through the deep snow. Even though they were only wearing their thin, patched clothes, they didn't seem to mind how cold it was. They moved on purpose, carrying things that couldn't be identified from a distance, and then disappeared into the snow-covered forest. The guards talked about whether they should step in and help or warn about the risks of being in such close contact with the sun. But something stopped them. There was something about that family's movements, a sureness that made me think they were very aware of what they were doing. Instead of being victims of the storm, they were part of something that went beyond what the human body can normally do. When winter was over and the trails could be used again, the rangers wrote down what they had seen. The doctors that were asked were not sure. These people said that no one could survive those temperatures without proper gear, let alone walk for hours in deep snow without getting hypothermia or frostbite. But the rangers were. They all said the same thing in their testimonies. It was something they had seen for themselves. There was no room for mistake or different meaning. Anthropologists started to guess about how bodies had changed over generations of living in extreme isolation. It's possible that that lineage had changed over time in subtle ways, creating unique ways to deal with problems in the environment. This idea gave people who needed scientific explanations a sense of comfort. That being said, there was something about this explanation that didn't quite fit. that the truth was much stranger and less comfortable than any theory in the academic world could explain. When the new century came, it brought big changes to the Appalachian area. Industrialization was moving quickly forward. Lumber companies were growing, and railroads were starting to reach places that people had thought were inaccessible before. With progress came the need to bring modern technology to even the most remote parts of North Carolina. But the Mountain family stayed a strange case, what was left of something that wouldn't be absorbed by the march of time. In 1901, a reporter from Asheville decided to look into the case in great detail. He was known for bravely reporting the news and going where others were afraid to. He spent weeks talking to people in the area to get their stories and figure out what was true and what was just folklore. He planned to write a series of articles that would finally reveal the truth about the mysterious family, giving a sense of reason to fear and superstition cloud the subject. The reporter got special permission to spend a week with the guards. He brought high-tech cameras, notebooks full of questions, and a strong desire to carefully record everything. He did this by closely watching the family's daily routine. In the first few days, his observations didn't show anything particularly interesting. The family went on with their strange but seemingly normal life, ignoring everything. His being there. The reporter did something risky on the third day. He went up to the patriarch directly and offered gifts, hoping to start a conversation. The old man politely took the things that were offered, but he wasn't interested in talking. When the reporter kept asking about the family's history, where it came from, and what it believed, all he got were blank stares and stubborn silence. It was pointless and frustrating, like trying to get confessions from old stones. But something happened that night. Changed. When the reporter woke up, one of the guards pointed to the forest with a tense face. People from the same family were in the ritual circle that had been found years earlier in a cleared area where fires had been burning for decades. They were placed around the outside in a certain pattern and at exact intervals. This time, there was no fire. There were only the still bodies in the dim light of the stars. The reporter tried to get closer to get a better look, but the guards did not let go. They were aware of there are lines that people shouldn't cross. They stayed where they were and looked through binoculars. The family stayed in that circular shape for hours, doing nothing. They didn't sing. They didn't move. They were just standing there like statues that were alive. When the sky turned gray with the first rays of dawn, they quietly left and went back to their homes as if nothing had happened. The journalist was very upset by what happened. The last time his articles came out, they had a very different tone from what he had planned at first. Instead of making sense, they turned into rambling thoughts about how little people know. He freely admitted that he didn't know how to answer the questions that kept coming up about communities that are so far from normal that they can't be put into any category. When the articles came out, they renewed interest in the case, but they also made people tired of hearing about it. People were sick of the unsolved crime and the police's inability to clearly explain your actions. There were calls for the family to be left alone, for the mountains to be made a restricted area, and for everyone to stop wasting time and money on constant surveillance. What was the real problem, after all, since the people were no longer going missing? Why not let those people live in complete isolation and a strange way if they wanted to? This view of being more tolerant caught on, especially among younger people who didn't have the fears that older people did. In 1902, there were serious talks about lowering security and maybe even taking down the outpost completely. The surgery cost a lot of money. The guards kept asking to be moved to other posts that weren't so far away from each other, and it became more and more unclear what the practical benefits were. But before a choice could be made, something happened that made all the worries come back. A geologist working for a mining company was making a map of the area's mineral deposits when he found something very interesting. In a deep cave, that was. He found marks on the walls hidden by a lot of plants. Not the marks that water or time naturally make, but carvings that were done on purpose, with the same symbols that were found around the family clearing. The cave went down quite a ways, and split into tunnels that looked like they had been partially changed by people. Because he was smart and brave, the geologist went as deep as his lamp would let him. Layers of those symbols were stuck on the walls, making it look like different generations had put their own marks on them. Hundreds of years. Things were also left in rock crevices that were made by nature. There were simple tools, vessels made of fired clay, and what looked like fabric that had been preserved by the dry conditions underground. As soon as he told people about his find, groups of archaeologists were quickly put together. Here was finally a chance to learn about that family's history through real objects, not just general observations. When the excavations began, they were done with great scientific interest and great care. Each artifact that was found. A lot of pictures were taken of the symbols, and they were compared to records from other known ancient cultures. The results were strange. The artifacts looked like they were from very different times. Some looked very new, but they were made with tools and methods from the 1800s. Others looked much older, maybe hundreds of years old, but they all had the same symbols, which suggests that culture has stayed the same over very long periods of time. How was it possible for one family to keep traditions that were so similar for so long? Digging in the cave revealed layers of human activity that didn't fit with any known timelines for the area. These layers were completely outside of recorded history. As the work went on, archaeologists became more and more confused as they recorded finds that did not fit into any known historical story. There were broken stone tools that looked like they were made by very old people, but there were also things that looked like they were made much more recently. It looked like that cave had been a place of safety for a tradition. That went on for hundreds of years without a break, kept alive by a lineage that refused to change or adapt. The patterns on the walls were the most interesting thing. They found carvings that looked more complex and old as they went deeper into the cave. In the deepest rooms, they found pictures that looked like maps of constellations, but they were arranged in ways that didn't match the night sky of any known time. There were spirals that were mathematically perfect and geometric diagrams that were surprisingly complicated. That showed a deep understanding of symmetry and proportions. How was it possible for people who lived in such basic conditions to make something so complex? A pre-Columbian culture expert among the archaeologists came up with a theory that caused a lot of debate. It's possible that that family came from a long-lost civilization that lived in the mountains before Europeans came to settle there. A group of people who, for some reason, chose to keep their traditions in their purest form, ignoring any outside influence through the generations. The theory seemed good because it was so simple, but it was clear that there were problems. In that part of the Appalachians, there were no records of any advanced civilization. Even if there had been one, how could it explain why some traditions have stayed the same over hundreds of years, even though a lot has changed around them? The cave discoveries got a lot of attention from academic institutions all over the country very quickly. Researchers from well-known universities went to North Carolina to look at the results for themselves. In scientific journals, there were heated arguments. Based on their own areas of expertise, each expert gave a different interpretation. Linguists tried to figure out what the symbols meant. The rocks were dated by geologists. Anthropologists also made models of how a culture that lived so far away could have grown and survived. But while the academics argued in their familiar nooks, something was changing in the heights. The family seemed to be aware that their holy cave was being dug up. The outpost guard said that people were acting differently in small ways. There was more activity at night, more gatherings in the ritual circle, and activities that were getting more intense in ways they couldn't fully understand. The patriarch had always stood in a detached, indifferent way, but now he often looked in the direction of the cave, and his expression was hard to read, but full of meaning. In the spring of 1903, archaeologists working in the cave found something that would change the investigation in a big way. They found a large room that had clearly been used for a ceremony hidden behind a narrow passage that required crawling through meters of wet rock in the deepest chamber that had ever been explored. There were pictures all over the walls, but they weren't the same pictures that were in the upper chambers. These pictures were more complicated and crowded together, making visual stories that seemed to tell stories. And in the middle of this room, something that made even the most doubtful researchers rethink what they thought they knew for sure. A carefully built stone structure that looked like it was used as an altar or center of attention. Things that shouldn't have been there were arranged in exact patterns around it. Pieces of metal that were worked with methods that seemed too advanced for the time period that the rock layers were dated to. Fabrics that were kept in an almost impossibly simple way, keeping their bright colors even though they looked very old, and most unsettlingly, organic remains that early tests suggested were hundreds of years or even thousands of years old. The discovery caused a lot of debate right away. How did those things stay alive for so long in a place where they were protected, but still exposed to moisture and natural breakdown? Was there something in that room that kept things safe longer than nature should have let it? Scientists, who were more realistic, said that the dates were wrong, that the samples were tainted, and that the procedures had to be looked over. But the more tests they did, the more they proved that the dates were impossible. At the same time, the family in the mountains became more and more upset. Because they were being watched, it was the first time they did something that could be seen as emotion. Not really anger or fear, but a deep sense of unease. They got together more often. Their conversations in that hard-to-understand language got more animated and important. The guards began to feel more and more uneasy, sensed that something was about to happen, a change that was coming soon that they couldn't see but could feel coming like a storm. One of the younger researchers, an anthropologist who had just graduated and had new ideas about how to engage with other cultures, chose to take a different approach. He suggested talking to the family directly, showing them the finds, and asking them what they meant instead of just studying the artifacts that had been taken out of the cave. It was a risky plan that could have been offensive to people whose someone had broken into a holy place. But he said that they would never really understand those symbols and rituals if they didn't learn about the culture of the practitioners. He carefully got permission from the authorities. With the help of armed guards and a translator who had studied isolated Appalachian dialects, he climbed up to the clearing carrying pictures of the symbols he had found in the cave. These pictures were detailed drawings of the most complicated patterns. The family watched as they walked up with that trait. Pay close, silent attention. When the anthropologist put out the pictures, the patriarch took them slowly and looked at each one so closely that his hands started to shake. The next thing that happened was totally unexpected. When the old man looked at the anthropologist, his eyes looked much younger and more alert than they ever had before. For the first time since they were found, he spoke in clear, understandable English. There was no sign of that strange dialect they always used. His voice was low but firm, and he chose each word with care. He said that those symbols were not for outsiders, and that they held secrets that should be kept secret. He also said that by showing them to the public in modern times, the researchers had set off something they couldn't control. This made the anthropologist very angry. Every other attempt to communicate had failed, and now, all of a sudden, this perfect articulation. He tried to get more information by asking, but the patriarch just shook his head. They gave back the pictures and walked away, which meant the conversation was over. The other family members started to move around and gather their things, as if they were getting ready for something. Their coordinated movements made it look like they had planned ahead and made up their minds. That night, the guards saw the family do the most complicated ritual they had ever seen. Everyone in the group got together in a circle, but this time they brought things from the cave that they had clearly stolen, before the digging started. These things seemed to make some kind of map or diagram because they were set up in certain patterns around the edge. Then they started to sing, but not with the crazy melodies that had been going on before. These were different, older ones that sounded so good that they seemed to make the air move. Something was changing, the guards could feel it. Even though it was spring, the temperature dropped by a lot. It looked like the starlight was warped above the circle, as if reality itself was being bent around that area. The trees around them, which were silent giants that had seen generations, started to sway even though there was no wind. Their leaves whispered in time with the chants. It was an experience that went beyond what science could explain. It reached deep into our minds, to places where ancestral fear still lived. The circle was empty when dawn came. The family was no longer there. There were no tracks or other signs of leaving on the trails. They were just not there anymore. The homes stayed put, with things still in their designated spots, but no sign of the people. It looked like they had disappeared into the mountain air and gone back to a strange place where they may have come from in the first place. The guards rushed down and told them the impossible news. In the weeks that followed, many searches were done all over the area, but no one from that strange family was ever seen again. When the family went missing, shockwaves went through the mountains of North Carolina and into other states. The police launched the biggest search operation ever. It took dozens of men searching every valley, cave, and lost trail in that area. People brought in hunting dogs to follow tracks that always ended in random places, as if people had disappeared in those parts of the forest. It didn't make sense and couldn't have happened, but the evidence pointed to it. The guards who saw what happened last night were questioned many times, and their stories were checked for errors or exaggerations, but they all insisted that what they said was true. Identical accounts of what happened, with details that matched up perfectly between different accounts. You couldn't say that they were making up what they said, because their words still carried the weight of what they had seen. In that ritual circle, something happened that didn't fit into any of the usual categories of explanation. Scientists who were working on the cave excavations were asked to give their thoughts. There might be clues in the pattern symbols that could help them figure out where the family had gone or how they had been able to disappear for so long. They were lost, though, just like everyone else. Through their research, they had learned about things that were complicated, old, and passed down from generation to generation, but nothing that made them think that something could just disappear without a trace. A theory gained traction among local residents, especially the older ones who remembered the legends told by their grandparents. They said the Appalachian Mountains were much older than any human civilization, that they had witnessed things before history began to be recorded. According to these stories, there were places in the mountains where the boundaries between the known world and something else were thinner. Places where people could cross over if they knew the right secrets, if they performed the appropriate rituals. The family, according to this interpretation, had simply returned to wherever they had originally come from. It was folklore, rural superstition, exactly the kind of thinking that the modern age should have. Overcome. But in the absence of rational explanations, even educated people began to consider possibilities they would previously have dismissed outright. The case so defied normal expectations that it forced the mind to search beyond the conventional limits of understanding. In 1904, the search was officially called off. There was nowhere left to look, no new leads to follow. The family had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. The outpost was dismantled, the guards reassigned, and slowly, life in the region began to return to normal. But the mystery remained, an open wound in the collective psyche of the community, something that could not be easily resolved or forgotten. The artifacts recovered from the cave were distributed among various academic institutions, each hoping to unravel their secrets through meticulous study. Decades of research would follow, generations of scholars dedicating entire careers to trying to understand those symbols, those patterns, that impossible culture. Some discoveries were made, small advances in understanding, but the overall picture remained fragmented, incomplete. There were fundamental pieces of the puzzle that simply could not be found. Knowledge that had disappeared along with the family. The clearing in the mountains remained untouched for years. No one wanted to build there. No one wanted to cultivate that land. There was a persistent feeling that the place was still marked, still somehow belonged to those mysterious people who had lived there for so long. Occasional travelers passing through the area reported strange sensations, impressions of being watched, sounds they couldn't identify, nothing definitive, nothing that could be scientifically documented, just that instinctive unease that made people quicken their pace. The newspapers eventually stopped publishing articles about the case. There were simply so many ways to retell the same unsolved mystery. The public lost interest, turning their attention to everyday concerns, to the technological advances that were transforming the country, to the political issues that seemed more urgent and relevant. The Appalachian family became a footnote in regional history, a curiosity occasionally mentioned, but rarely examined in depth. But for those who had been directly involved, the guards, the investigators, the residents who had felt the weight of that strange presence in the mountains, forgetting was not possible. They carried the memories for the rest of their lives, stories they would tell their children and grandchildren, though, always with the awareness that their words could never fully convey the reality of those experiences. There was something in those events that resisted narrative that always remained slightly beyond the reach of language. Decades later, in the mid-nth century, when the region had completely transformed, when paved roads cut through the mountains and tourists visited national parks, where once there was only impenetrable jungle, curious reports occasionally surfaced. Hikers on remote trails spoke of finding symbols carved into ancient trees, marks that didn't correspond to any modern vandalism, but seemed to echo those patterns documented at the beginning of the century. They were probably just coincidences, human eyes trained to find patterns where only randomness existed. But there was always that small doubt, that whispered possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, the story hadn't completely ended that spring morning when the family disappeared. The cave was eventually closed to the public, deemed dangerous, due to its structural instability, but some more daring adventurers still found ways to enter. Exploring those deep chambers with modern flashlights, photographing the symbols on the walls, trying to sense some echo of that ancient presence. Their unauthorized expeditions usually ended in frustration. The cave was just a cave, rock and darkness, nothing more. Any magic that might have existed there had vanished along with those who understood its secrets. And yet on the darkest nights, when the moon was absent and the mountains were plunged into absolute darkness, locals occasionally reported seeing lights high above. Not the lights of campsites or the lanterns of lost hikers, but that greenish luminescence that had been documented so many years before, moving among the trees with incomprehensible purpose, dancing in patterns that seemed to mean something to unseen observers. No one took these reports very seriously. They were ghost stories, local legends kept alive because every region needs its mysteries to capture the imagination. Years turned into decades, and the Appalachian family's case gradually merged into the fabric of regional legends. But in 1947, something happened that would rekindle interest in that nearly forgotten story. A history professor at the University of North Carolina, researching county archives for a project on isolated Appalachian communities, discovered documents that had been incorrectly filed and remained uncatalogued for decades. These were the complete records of the original investigations, including photographs that had never been published and witness reports that had been deemed too sensitive for public release at the time. Among these documents, he found something particularly intriguing. Our diary, kept by one of the outpost guards, written during the months leading up to the family's disappearance. The initial entries were routine, mundane observations about the weather, the monotony of the watch, minor complaints about the food and the isolation. But as the pages turned, the tone changed dramatically. The guard began to record disturbing dreams that plagued him night after night. Dreams where he walked through the mountains and encountered impossible structures, entire cities hidden in valleys that shouldn't exist. People who spoke without moving their lips, sharing knowledge that his waking mind couldn't retain. What was most unsettling was that other guards mentioned similar experiences in their reports. Not just one man suffering from loneliness and an overactive imagination, but multiple independent individuals reporting parallel phenomena. They discussed these dreams amongst themselves, trying to find rational explanations. Perhaps something in the water they drank, some natural substance in the mountains that caused shared hallucinations, or perhaps the very presence of that strange family. Their radically different way of life created a kind of psychological contagion that affected those who observed them for an extended period. The professor was fascinated. He decided to conduct his own investigation, visiting the locations described in the documents, and interviewing descendants of the people involved in the original case. Many of the protagonists had already passed away, but their children and grandchildren preserved stories passed down through generations, and these stories, although varying in detail, maintained consistent central elements. The strange family living an impossible life, the inexplicable phenomena, the disappearance that defied all logic. During his research, the professor discovered that the clearing in the mountains still existed, although the forest had advanced considerably, reclaiming the space that had been kept clear for decades. He organized an expedition, taking students and documentation equipment with him. When they finally reached the site, they found that the primitive structures had completely collapsed, returned to the earth from whence they came. But the ritual circle was still visible, a circular depression in the ground where nothing grew, as if the land there had been permanently altered in some way. The students, pragmatic young people of the post-war era, initially treated everything as a historical curiosity, an interesting story but fundamentally explainable through science and reason. They camped near the clearing, planning to spend several days documenting the site, collecting soil samples, mapping the surrounding areas. But on the first night, their certainties began to waver. The atmosphere changed drastically after sunset. The silence of the forest became oppressive, a kind of stillness that was not simply an absence of sound, but something more active, more present. One of the students, a skeptical young man who had scoffed at the stories throughout the trip, swore he had seen figures moving among the trees around the camp, not animals, but humanoid forms that appeared briefly on the periphery of the campfire light before fading into the darkness. His colleagues initially attributed it to nervousness and suggestion, but as the night progressed, others began to report similar experiences. Sensations of being watched, impressions of invisible presences circling the perimeter of the camp. sounds that seemed almost to form words in that strange dialect described in the old documents. The professor tried to maintain scientific rationality, explaining each phenomenon through natural causes. The human brain was programmed to find patterns, to interpret ambiguous stimuli as potential threats. In an unfamiliar environment, especially after spending days immersed in disturbing stories, it was completely natural for his perceptions to be colored by expectation. But even he couldn't completely deny the discomfort he felt, that primal sensation that something fundamentally wrong with that place was happening. The following morning, they discovered something that hadn't been mentioned in any of the historical documents. Following an almost imperceptible trail leading from the ritual circle, they found another cave chamber, smaller than the main one, but clearly connected to the same system. The walls here were covered not with the ancient symbols, but with something more recent. Charcoal drawings, depicting scenes that seemed like narratives, human figures in circular formations, star patterns, and curiously representations of what appeared to be the mountains themselves, seen from an impossible perspective, as if drawn by someone observing from a great height in the sky. They took extensive photographs and collected charcoal samples for dating. Later results suggested that the markings had been made sometime in the early 20th century, possibly a few years before the family disappeared. It was like if they had left a final record, a message for whoever came after. But if it was a message, its meaning remained opaque. Scholars who examined the photographs in the following decades would propose dozens of different interpretations, none definitive or speculative. The professor published his findings in 1949 in an academic paper that generated considerable debate. Some colleagues praised the meticulousness of the research, the way he had recovered a nearly lost story and presented evidence that deserved serious study. Others criticized what they considered creedle, suggesting that he had been seduced by the mysterious nature of the case and lost the necessary scientific objectivity. The truth, as often happens, probably lay somewhere in between. What could not be denied was that the case exerted a peculiar fascination on those who studied it in depth. There was something about that story that resisted closure, that continued to generate new questions even after decades of investigation. And it wasn't just academic fascination. Ordinary people, locals, tourists who heard the stories all felt that strange attraction, that need to understand what had really happened in those mountains at the beginning of the century. In the 1950s and 1960s, when American culture went through big changes, people became much more interested in mysteries that no one could explain. A new generation found out about the Appalachian family case again, but this time they looked at it in a different way. Some saw it as proof of other dimensions, while others saw it as proof of lost knowledge from ancestors. There were even people who thought there might be links with visitors from other worlds, but most serious researchers didn't believe this. In the end, the area around the clearing was turned into a state park. Informational signs were put up that told the story in a clean way, leaving out the most upsetting parts in favor of a story that focused on cultural isolation and how people have adapted to live in harsh environments. Tourists sometimes came and took pictures, talked about how lovely the mountains were. Most people never learned about the darker parts of the story, like the disappearances, rituals, and strange things that happened that scared people in the past. But people who went off the marked trails and explored the most remote areas sometimes came back with strange stories about seeing symbols carved into trees that weren't on official maps and finding circular clearings where nothing grew that were spread out across the mountains like dots in an invisible pattern, having the sense of being watched by eyes that never fully showed themselves. A documentary filmmaker working alone tried to make a movie about the case in 1973. He spent months in the area talking to longtime residents and filming historical sites in an effort to capture the feeling that the mountains gave off. It was never finished making the documentary, The director abruptly quit the project and wouldn't talk about why. In an interview with a small magazine years later, he would only. He should have said that there were things that happened to him while filming that made him question his own sanity, and that people's curiosity should not go too far. The unfinished documentary's archives were eventually given to a university, but no one looked at them for decades. In the early 2000s, when the tapes were finally digitized, researchers found hours of footage that had never been cut down. Most of it was standard stuff, like normal interviews and mountain scenes. But there were parts of the movie that were shot at night and showed things that humans shouldn't be able to see, like shadows and patterns of light that moved in ways that didn't make sense. And in one very disturbing scene, what looked like humanoid figures were seen standing in the background and watching the film crew without moving. They just disappeared in the next frame. Techs look at the video, trying to find signs of editing or problems with the camera that could explain what happened. Weird things. They couldn't come to a conclusion. The pictures were real. The camera had recorded them exactly as they showed up on the tape. Whatever they had caught had really been in the Appalachian Mountains that night, watching in silence as strangers tried to figure out secrets that maybe shouldn't have been told. We have reached the end of our journey through the Appalachian Mountains, where a mysterious family lived on the edges of society and kept secrets that were beyond the reach of most people. We are reminded by this story that there are places where reality seems less solid and the unexplainable can live, even in a world that wants to list and explain every mystery. In spite of everything that has happened on their steep slopes and deep valleys, the mountains still stand. The clearing is still there, but it's hidden by layers of plants that are trying to take back the space. The land is still marked by the ritual circle, which is where the family did their strange rituals. A scar that won't go away. That being said, some people still say they feel something different in the air on nights when there is no moon, when it is completely dark and quiet, as if someone had never left. We'll never know for sure what happened that morning in the spring when the family didn't come home. The signs will always be hard for us to fully understand. They left marks on stone and wood, messages from a culture that existed at the same time as our own. That might be what some mysteries are really about. They're not meant to be solved. Instead, they're meant to be there as reminders that our knowledge of the world is always limited by what we can see and understand. People have been interested in the story of the Appalachian family for a long time, but it has a deeper meaning as well. It speaks to the deepest part of us that remembers a time when the world was bigger, wilder, and full of possibilities that couldn't be explained. Now that we have satellites and instant. In this age of communication, where every part of the world has been photographed and mapped, stories like this one remind us that there may still be places we don't fully understand, where the unknown lives on. There is still no clear translation for the symbols found in the caves. It's still not clear what patterns the family followed in their daily lives. The lights that danced through the trees have never been fully explained, and the disappearance, that last act of total destruction, is still a mystery. One big mystery that all the other questions circle around without being able to settle on a center. It seems poetically right that this should happen, a lineage that lived so long out of sight from the rest of the world that they refused to be merged or explained, and when they finally left, they did so in a way that made it impossible to fully understand or group them. They were a secret until the very end, and even after. People who are looking for the unexplainable continue to be drawn to the Appalachians. Hikers walk along. Forgotten trails. Explorers look for caves that haven't been explored yet, and every once in a while, someone comes back with a story about something they saw or felt that they can't quite explain. Maybe they are just impressions, the result of thinking about old stories. Or maybe the mountains really do have secrets they'd rather not share. We can think about how many other families, communities, and ways of life may have existed on the edges of history that have not been written down. How many lives were lost? People lived and died without leaving a record in official records, so those who kept the records of civilization didn't notice. It was interesting that the Appalachian family was found, written down, and studied. But how many others were never found? They lived their strange lives by themselves or disappeared without anyone knowing they were there. This is the end of our look into one of the scariest and most mysterious cases the mountains have ever had. A story about being alone to the fullest, of traditions passed down from generation to generation, and a way of life that didn't make sense in today's world. A story that makes us wonder more than it explains, that leaves us with more questions than answers. And maybe that's the best way for things to be. If you've made it this far, you might want to subscribe to the channel to see more stories that go into the dark and forgotten parts of the past. Write a comment about what you think about this case. Also, if you know of any other stories about communities that are cut off, please share them. Or mysteries that haven't been solved, please let us know. And if you like this kind of content, your like really helps get these stories in front of more people who like strange things. The Appalachian Mountains are still there, forever and silent. They hide their secrets behind thick forests and layers of mist. And maybe, somewhere in those forgotten heights, the sounds of that mysterious family can still be heard. They aren't preserved in papers or photos, but in the very spirit of that old, unchanged place. Some stories never really end. They just blend in with the land that made them, becoming a permanent part of the mystery that makes up the places where the known and the unknown meet.